He used to stand beneath the bright lights, his laughter echoing through rooms filled with strangers. Every smile, every punchline was a shield, a mask hiding the storm that brewed beneath his ribs. Steve had built his life around noise, applause, attention, success, anything loud enough to drown out the silence he feared. Because in the silence, he could hear the truth that something was missing, something far deeper than fame could ever touch. It started one night after a show. The crowd had dispersed, the lights had dimmed, and the dressing room was quiet. He sat in front of the mirror, still in his suit, makeup slightly smudged, eyes tired. He didn't see the man everyone else saw, not the comedian, not the star. He saw a man who'd spent years chasing validation, running from the emptiness that followed him like a shadow. He whispered to himself, "Why does it still feel like I'm dying inside?" That question haunted him. Every night in hotel rooms across the world, he stared at the ceiling and thought about death, not the way most people do, but as if it were a mirror reflecting everything he'd avoided. He realized he'd built his empire on fragile foundations. Applause fades, lights burn out, people forget. And in that realization, something broke. One day during a trip abroad, he met a man, not famous, not wealthy, just a man sitting quietly on a prayer mat in the corner of an airport. Steve watched as the man laid his forehead to the ground, whispering words he didn't understand. There was peace in that moment, not performance, not desperation, just stillness. It shook him. How could someone so ordinary look so complete, while he, with everything, felt so hollow? He couldn't get that image out of his head. It followed him like a haunting melody, the quiet rhythm of surrender. He started asking questions, searching for answers in places he'd never dared to look. And every path led him back to the same truth, Islam. Not the Islam he thought he knew, the one filtered through headlines and fear, but the Islam that spoke of peace, discipline, mercy, and purpose. He began to read, at first out of curiosity. Then, out of hunger, he read verses that spoke of life as a test, of death not as an end, but a beginning. He read about prayer 5 times a day, and how each bow, each whisper was a reminder that we are not gods of our own worlds, that we come from dust, and to dust we return. He started waking up before dawn, just to feel what those words meant. He'd sit in the stillness of the morning, when the world was asleep, and whisper prayers he barely knew how to say. And in that quiet, something shifted. For the first time in his life, he wasn't performing. But change never comes without struggle. He felt the pull of his old life. The noise, the spotlight, the comfort of ego. People around him didn't understand. They thought he was lost. Some mocked him. Others whispered that he'd gone too far. But inside, he'd never felt clearer. He realized that when you start seeking truth, you lose people, but you find yourself. He began to see death differently. Not as an enemy, but as a teacher. Death became a reminder that every breath was borrowed, every moment a gift. He once feared the silence of the grave. Now he saw it as a passage, not an ending, but a homecoming. He found comfort in knowing that life wasn't about how long you lived, but how sincerely you lived it. There were nights when he still struggled, when the weight of his past pressed heavy on his chest. But now, instead of drowning in guilt, he'd bow his head and whisper, "God, guide me." And somehow the darkness lifted. He began to see the world through new eyes, not as a place of chaos, but of divine order. Every sunrise was a reminder of mercy, every hardship a hidden lesson. He stopped asking, "Why me?" and started asking, "What can I learn?" He realized Islam wasn't about rules or restrictions. It was about alignment, aligning your soul with truth, your actions with gratitude, and your heart with peace. The man who once lived for laughter began to live for silence. The man who once feared death began to prepare for it, not with fear, but with faith. He said once that the greatest freedom he ever felt wasn't when he made it to fame, but when he fell to his knees in prayer and admitted that he was not in control. There's a strange beauty in surrender. It doesn't make you weak, it makes you weightless. And as he walked through the years, carrying faith where fame once was, he found what he'd been searching for all along. He found peace. And when he looked in the mirror now, he didn't see a man pretending to be happy. He saw a man finally at ease with life, with death, with everything in between. The smile was still there, but this time it was real. He thought peace was the end of the story, but peace was only the beginning of a greater test. Because once you find peace, the world will try everything to take it away from you. The first sign came quietly, almost too quietly to notice. Small inconveniences, lost opportunities, whispers in the background. At first, he brushed them off. He told himself it was just life being life. But deep down, a feeling began to crawl under his skin. A sense that something unseen was shifting around him. The calls began to slow down. The same networks that once begged for his presence suddenly forgot his number. The friends who had once filled his table with laughter became ghosts, busy, distant, polite. The world he'd once ruled was fading, and he could feel it happening in real time. He sat alone in his mansion one night, lights dim, television off. The silence felt different now, not peaceful, heavy. He stared at his phone, waiting for a call that wouldn't come. The emptiness wasn't loneliness. It was revelation, the realization that the world only loves you when you entertain it. But he remembered the lessons. He remembered the prayer. So he stood, walked into the small room he had turned into a place of worship, and knelt. The rug beneath him felt softer than it had any right to be. The air smelled faintly about in tears. He whispered the words he'd learned, halting, imperfect, but sincere. And as his forehead touched the ground, he felt it again, that quiet peace that no fame could replicate. But when he rose, the phone was still silent. That's when the second test began, the one that shakes every man who claims to have found faith, the test of patience. Days became weeks, weeks bled into months. Projects vanished, meetings were canceled, people began to move on without him. He wasn't bitter, he was confused, because he had done everything right. He'd turned away from arrogance, he'd humbled himself, he'd prayed. And yet here he was, forgotten by the very world he once carried on his shoulders. One night, as he sat alone in the dark, rain tapping against the window, he whispered something he hadn't said in years. God, are you still with me? The words echoed in the emptiness. For a moment, he regretted saying them. But then the power went out, total silence, total darkness. And in that darkness, something stirred. He couldn't explain it. A coldness crept through the room. Not the kind that touches your skin, but the kind that touches your soul. It was as if the room itself was breathing, as if something unseen was standing just beyond the edge of the light. He froze. His heartbeat slowed. Then came the whisper. It wasn't a voice, not human, not audible, but clear like a thought that didn't belong to him. You found peace, but can you keep it when the world burns? He opened his eyes, breath trembling. The power flickered back on. The rain had stopped, but something inside him had changed. He understood. Faith isn't proven when life is calm. It's proven in the fire. From that night on, his life turned. Everything that once stood stable began to tremble. Financial deals collapsed. Old mistakes resurfaced. News outlets that once praised him now dragged his name through dirt. People twisted his faith into headlines, mocking, doubting, condemning. But he didn't respond. He didn't fight. He simply prayed harder. And yet, the darker the world became, the brighter something inside him grew. He began to see what others couldn't, that pain was purification, that every loss was God's way of carving out space for something purer to live. He started visiting hospitals, orphanages, mosques in quiet corners of cities. He didn't announce it. He didn't post it. He simply went, listened, helped. There among the forgotten, he found truth. He met men who smiled despite having nothing, children who laughed through hunger, women who carried grief with grace. One man, an older man with trembling hands, told him something that changed everything. God doesn't take from you to punish you. He takes to teach you who you are without the things you love. Those words stayed with him. He began to notice signs, small, subtle, but undeniable. Every time he thought he'd lost everything, something new appeared. A stranger's kindness, a moment of peace, a verse that felt written just for him. He realized that life wasn't falling apart. It was falling into place. But there was one fear he still couldn't escape. Death. It haunted him like a shadow he could never outrun. He'd made peace with life, but death still felt like an unwritten chapter, a place he wasn't sure he'd belong. One evening, he attended a funeral. A man he barely knew, a distant acquaintance. The room was filled with people, yet it felt empty. The air was thick with unspoken questions. As he stood over the casket, he noticed something. The man's face, peaceful. The kind of peace that doesn't come from life, but from release. For the first time, Steve didn't see death as a thief. He saw it as a door. That night, he couldn't sleep. He sat in his garden, looking up at the stars, thinking about that man. about how temporary everything was, how even the brightest light fades. But what lies beyond is eternal. He whispered softly, if death is a door, then I'm ready to knock. The next morning, he woke up before dawn. He performed ablution, stood in silence, and prayed. As he bowed, a tear slipped down his cheek, not of sadness, but of surrender. That day, he felt lighter, like something invisible had been lifted off his back. He began speaking differently, walking differently. People noticed. His words carried gravity, his silence carried meaning. He was no longer the man chasing the world. He was the man who had stopped running. But then came the real test, the one that breaks even the strongest of believers. His mother fell ill. She had always been his anchor, his quiet strength, his reminder of home. Watching her fade was like watching time eat away at the last piece of his soul. Every hospital visit felt heavier, every prayer more desperate. One night, the doctor pulled him aside. It's time, he said softly. Steve nodded numb. He walked into the room, sat beside her, and held her hand. Her eyes fluttered open, weak but warm. My boy, she whispered, you finally found what I prayed for all these years. He swallowed hard. What's that, Mama? Peace with God. She smiled, faint, fragile, eternal. And then she was gone. He didn't cry at first. He just sat there holding her hand as the world outside continued like nothing had happened. Nurses moved, machines beeped. Life went on. But when he got home, he fell to his knees. The sobs came in waves, violent, uncontrollable, breaking every piece of his composure. Yet even in that collapse, he found something holy. Because grief, he realized, is just love with nowhere to go. He prayed that night longer than ever before. He didn't ask for anything. He just spoke to God the way a child speaks to a father. When he finished, he felt something he couldn't explain. Not joy, not relief, but understanding. The kind that comes only when you lose what you love most and still choose to trust. After his mother's passing, he withdrew from the world. For months, he disappeared from cameras, from interviews, from noise. People speculated. Some said he was broken. Others said he'd lost his mind. But in truth, he was rebuilding it. He spent those months in silence, studying, reflecting, praying. He began to understand the verses, not just with his mind, but with his soul. Every word of the Quran became a mirror, reflecting pieces of himself he'd never seen before. One verse struck him deeply. Verily, with hardship comes ease. He realized the ease isn't always after the hardship. Sometimes it's within it. When he finally returned to the public eye, he wasn't the same man. The crowd noticed. His voice carried a new depth, his humor a gentleness it never had before. He spoke a purpose of faith, of surrender, not from a stage, but from experience. He told them, you don't find peace when everything's perfect. You find it when everything falls apart, and you still say, Alhamdulillah. The room went silent. It wasn't a punchline. It was truth. But there was one last trial waiting for him, the kind that doesn't come from the world, but from within. One night, he woke up in pain. Sharp, burning, unnatural. He gasped, clutching his chest. The house was quiet. The world asleep. For a split second, he thought, this is it. His mind flashed through everything, his mistakes, his prayers, his regrets, his mother's smile. He could almost hear her voice saying, he calls you. He closed his eyes, whispering, God, if this is my time, let me leave with faith. But then the pain eased, the darkness lifted. He was still alive. He sat up, drenched in sweat, heart pounding. That moment changed him. It wasn't just a health scare. It was a reminder that every breath is a borrowed gift. From that day, he lived differently. Every morning began with gratitude. Every night ended in reflection. He gave more, spoke less, forgave quickly, and loved deeply. He stopped fearing death because he finally understood it. Death wasn't the end of life. It was the continuation of truth. Years passed. His fame faded quietly, gracefully, but his peace grew louder. People still came to him, not for jokes, but for wisdom, for the calm in his voice, for the light in his eyes that only those who face darkness carry. He once said in a small interview few people ever saw, I used to think faith was about knowing all the answers. Now I know it's about being at peace with the questions. The interviewer didn't understand what he meant, but he didn't explain. Some truths aren't meant to be explained, only felt. And when people asked him what changed him the most, he smiled and said, Islam didn't just change my view of life and death. It taught me how to live between them. Then, as the cameras turned off and the lights dimmed, He whispered the same words that had carried him through every storm. All that I lost brought me here to what really matters. And that, my friend, is everything. The voice fades, the screen darkens, and in that silence, you can almost hear it, the echo of a man who finally found peace, not in the applause of the world, but in the whisper of his soul.